So the first slide we're going to think about is kind of setting out the challenge for involuntarism. So to start off with, we're going to start by thinking about actions. So consider a case where you're forced to do something. So an example that comes up a lot in the literature is imagine that you bump into somebody in a crowded room because you've been pushed over into them, and compare that to a case where because of your irresponsibility or your actions, you've decided to knock someone over. In these two cases where you yourself have been pushed versus where you haven't been pushed, what do we think about your responsibility? I'm sorry, and whether people can hold you responsible for those actions? It seems like for most people, the intuition is that if you're forced to do something, so if you're pushed into somebody, it makes little sense to hold you responsible for it. And the idea might be that we can kind of run a similar argument here in the epistemic case. So if you if you didn't choose to form certain beliefs or choose to have certain attitudes, then we might think that we can't hold you responsible for those things that you didn't choose. So an example to kind of motivate this might be a case of brainwashing. So if we imagine a hypothetical case where somebody controls your mind, forces you to have certain beliefs, it doesn't seem to make much sense to hold you responsible for those beliefs because you didn't have any choice over whether to form them. But the involuntarist challenge is to suggest that even though we have brainwashing cases where in these cases it's clear that you don't have any control over the beliefs that you form, the involuntarist wants to suggest that in everyday cases we're actually in a pretty similar position, not because someone else has deprived us of choice over which beliefs that we form, but rather because we don't have any choice over the beliefs that we form in the first place. So one of the things that we want to set out here is this idea of the responsibility principle, as I've termed it. So this is the idea that some agent X can only be held responsible for Y if X had control over Y. So this seems to be something that has application in the case of actions. We might think it also has application in the case of beliefs as well. So what does this actually mean, though? Because we have this word control here, and that seems to be something that is slightly underdefined at the moment. So I'm going to understand control as the ability to do or not do X intentionally, where X is some action. So if you have control over what you do or what you believe, then you can choose to do it or not do it intentionally. And intentionally is important here. So the big worry here, as I've said, is that we don't seem to have control over which beliefs we form, or at least that's the argument. So it's worth noting that this, might not be super intuitive, as we saw in the last lecture from Basu. This idea that we don't have control over which beliefs we form, and therefore shouldn't be held responsible for them, is slightly revisionist because we do often hold people responsible for their beliefs in the everyday.